federal powers at play felt that they were a frontier for education and for assimilation, and now we're learning it was more of a frontier for cultural genocide.
All that remains of the Genoa Indian Industrial School is this manual training building and a few scattered barns. But from 1884 to 1934, this site in central Nebraska was home to one of the first, largest, and longest-running residential schools for Native children in North America, enrolling over 4,300 children from over 40 tribes. Genoa Indian School, located in Genoa, Nebraska, was part of the federal boarding school system intended to eliminate traditional ways of life by forcing indigenous children to assimilate into mainstream American culture. This frontier in education failed, leading to trauma and loss of language, culture, and extended family systems. President George Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox were the first to propose the cultural assimilation of Native Americans. In the late 1700s, their so-called civilizing policy encouraged natives to adopt agriculture and European cultural values. During the early 19th century, as European immigrants pushed the frontier west into Nebraska and Kansas territories, the government took land from the Native Americans living there, including the Pawnee in Genoa, Nebraska, giving it to white settlers. After decades of skirmishes and wars, social reformers believed they could end conflicts between settlers and Indians on the frontier by teaching Native children to become white. In the 1880s, the federal Indian policy shifted from removal to total assimilation, and education was central to that new policy. The movement to Americanize Indian children through education was led by Richard Henry Pratt, a veteran of the American Civil and Indian Wars, who proposed a final Indian war of cultural genocide waged against children. His common refrain was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." In 1879, Pratt opened the first government-run boarding school for Native Americans in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which spawned 40 similar schools across the U.S., including the fourth one in Genoa, Nebraska. The story of Genoa Indian Industrial School begins in 1866 with a schoolhouse on the Loup River taken from the Pawnee when they were forced out of Nebraska. More than 100 miles from any reservation, the government found this remote schoolhouse an ideal site for a new experiment in education. When students arrived at Genoa in 1884, they found an environment very different from their native life. Students enter the campus through the symbolic arch, which a school publication called the royal gateway that stands between the old life of the Indian and a new grand existence. The assimilation process began immediately upon arrival. The students' long hair, a sign of strength and native identity, was cut, and they were issued military uniforms and new names. The school took promotional before and after photos of new students. The change in their appearance was intended to illustrate a personal transformation. Students quickly learned that Genoa was run like a military camp, as the school sought to instill habits of punctuality, discipline, and obedience. One student recalls, "Everything was controlled by whistles and bells. We marched everywhere." Believing that assimilation required total immersion and removal from the influences of native culture, the school separated children from their families. The school rarely allowed students to leave and required expensive fees and special permissions to visit home. Students came to Genoa as young as 4 and often stayed until they were 20. Many of the descendants of Genoa's students relate the trauma caused by this separation.
You know, it would be like someone grabbing your child when they're 6 and sending them off for 10, 15 years. Some of them were young and never came home.
Some parents sent their children willingly, hoping for a better life. Other families were forcibly separated under a federal compulsory attendance law. Genoa struggled to fill high enrollment quotas, and the superintendent complained about what he called the ignorant prejudices of the Indians to accept the blessing of free education. But whether by force, intimidation, persuasion, or choice, Genoa grew from a single schoolhouse to a 640-acre campus with over 30 buildings, including a hospital, dormitories, manual training buildings, a dining hall, agricultural buildings, and more. For half the day, the school taught basic reading, writing, and math. The suppression of native languages was central to the school's assimilation efforts. Students who were caught speaking any language other than English were severely punished. For students, this created confusion, tension, and a feeling of isolation. One student recalled returning home after years of English immersion at Genoa and making the tragic discovery that he could no longer speak with the people he loved. After class lessons, the rest was vocational education. For boys, it was carpentry, blacksmithing, farming, printing, brickmaking, or saddle making. For girls, it was sewing, cooking, laundry, and housekeeping. This work was intended to prepare students for low-wage, menial jobs based on the racist assumption that Native children had no aptitude for higher learning. The school was chronically underfunded, receiving mere $200 per student each year. As a result, it relied heavily on student labor for operations and revenue. School newspapers proudly reported students were being pushed to the greatest possible extent, working day and night owing to a pressing demand for the goods. One worried father wrote to the government to warn, "The children who go to the Indian school at Genoa are no more or less than slaves." Genoa made national headlines when local farmers objected to child labor, fearing it would put them out of work. The assimilation process did not end in the classroom. Genoa offered supervised activities, including athletic teams, bands, scouting clubs, student publications, and debate clubs. School officials believed these activities promoted individualism, sportsmanship, patriotism, self-control, and loyalty. Also, the spectacle of students performing and competing drew large crowds, generating publicity and revenue for the school. Students were required to adopt Christianity and attend church every Sunday. Former student Edward Hatchett remembered the sermons all had the same message, which he summarized as, "What your parents and the medicine men told you is wrong. You heathens need saved, or you will go to hell." Students endured abuse at the hands of Genoa's superintendent and disciplinarian, including beatings, whippings, solitary confinement, and withholding of food. Infectious disease was a serious problem at Genoa, where overcrowding and poor sanitation led to outbreaks of pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis. At least 86 students are believed to have died at the school. Students resisted in ways big and small. Many attempted to run away, but were usually captured, returned, and punished. Another way students practiced resistance was through writing. School newspapers contained subtle criticism, but some students took a more direct approach. In 1923, a group of brave students wrote to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to report abuse, leading to investigations. Former teachers confirmed the claims of abuse. One testified saying they were beaten up like dogs until the blood would flow out of their noses. Those who stepped forward faced retaliation, but they helped sway public opinion, causing the school's superintendent of 24 years to resign. In 1928, a report commissioned by Lewis Merriam detailed poor conditions on reservations and in schools and drew public attention to the failure of assimilationist policies. A former student of Genoa, Henry Roe Cloud, of the Winnebago tribe, spoke nationally about the deficiencies of the government-run Indian schools and was instrumental in passing the Indian Reorganization Act, better known as the Indian New Deal. The Genoa school was shut down in the summer of 1934 when President Franklin Roosevelt signed the act, ending 40 years of failed assimilation policy. Few people today remember the Genoa Industrial School, but for the past 30 years, survivors and their descendants have returned to Genoa to share memories and experiences. Some are fond memories. Brad Wolf's father was grateful for the education and credits Genoa for his success in life.
The impact of the Genoa Indian School on our family, like my dad, has been positive, and that's because of the fact that he quickly developed in his own mind the importance of education.
Other survivor descendants, including Judy Goshkabas, speak of the generational trauma the school caused their families.
And I have to work really hard to keep a balance, to not let it get me down, because I want to celebrate life and be well and healthy.
As one of the first, largest, and longest-running federal boarding schools, Genoa was a blueprint for assimilation schools across North America. For many years, native boarding schools were a forgotten part of our history, but the recent discovery of cemeteries and unmarked graves at these sites has brought renewed attention. Efforts are underway to locate the school cemetery in Genoa and similar schools. A 2022 government report notes the number of children who died could climb to the thousands or tens of thousands nationwide. The Genoa Indian Industrial School was a failed frontier in education. For 50 years, the school subjected children to manual labor and abuse, and descendants of former students are crying out for justice and healing. Organizers of the school felt there was a gap between civilization and savagery that could be filled with education. And while this attempted cultural genocide led to generational trauma that still persists today, it did not kill the Indian, as Richard Henry Pratt had hoped. The school brought children from different tribes together, leading to pan-Indian movements against domination and assimilation. And today, the survivors of the system are working to preserve the language and culture that the Genoa Industrial Indian School sought to take away.